1867-68. In a letter to his family in England, Hudson wrote that the only thing that kept his mind off his grief was the work he did with Maria. And they did work. Perhaps in determination not to let their daughter's death be for nothing, they devoted themselves anew to the task of reaching inland China with the gospel. Before the close of 1867, little more than a year after the band of inexperienced missionaries had arrived in Shanghai, all the prefectural governing cities in Gaicheng had been visited. Nanking finally had been reached by a missionary, and the members of the mission were working in centers as much as 24 days' journey apart. The church in Hangzhou was well established with Wang Leijun, Hudson's Chinese helper, who had gone back to England with him as its pastor. And by the spring of 1868, it looked possible for the Taylors to be spared from that center to help in expanding the work on some newer frontier. In those days, opening any new mission station in China included the risk of death itself. Riots occurred so often that they became almost an accepted part of existence. So it seemed a natural and necessary question for Hudson to ask one missionary candidate who had only one leg and could walk only with the help of a crutch, "But what would you do in China if a riot broke out and you had to run away?" "I had not considered running away," the man answered quietly, and citing Scripture added confidently, "I thought that the lame were to take the prey." And in fact, after the man was accepted by the mission and helped open a new station in Wanzhou, that confidence was tested. "Why don't you run away?" yelled the rioters, who were robbing him of everything he had and had even taken away his crutches. "Run away?" he replied with a smile. "How can a man run with only one leg, I should like to know?" Disarmed by his courage and friendliness, the rioters stopped their rampage, and calm was restored. The same spirit of confident faith marked George Duncan, the tall, quiet Highlander who had made his way to Nanking as the first resident missionary there. The people of that city, which had felt the brunt of war as the old Taiping capital, remained so wary of any foreign interest that city officials sent word to all the innkeepers that the foreigner was not to be given any lodging. Fortunately, the priest in charge of the city drum tower hadn't been warned, probably because no one considered him a possible host. Indeed, he had no proper room for visitors. But when a weary and discouraged George Duncan inquired, the man told him that he could stay in the tower at night if he wished, as long as he was out during the day so as not to frighten the people who came to the tower to worship. "It proved a particular miserable place to live," wrote Duncan. "We gladly accepted it and managed very nicely, though we have rather more rats than I like. At night they want to devour everything." Between the constant scurrying of the rodents and the regular solemn sounding of the drums, the missionary didn't get much sleep. And at dawn he had to roll up his bedding and turn out on the streets to spend the day in tea shops and the marketplace, sharing the gospel as best he could while trying to learn the local dialect. "I'm not able to talk much," he wrote, "but God helping me, I will say what I can." Eventually, a local carpenter risked renting the foreigner a portion of an upstairs room where his own Chinese family lived. And not long after that, Duncan convinced the carpenter to rent a portion of a street-level room, which he partitioned off as a narrow little chapel, the first Christian church in Nanking. Soon after his arrival in Nanking, George Duncan had sent Hudson the names of 2 banks that had representatives back in Hangzhou. When one bank failed and the other left the city, there was no longer any channel for headquarters to provide him with the funds he needed to live and carry on his work. Duncan didn't worry, even when he had to change his last piece of silver and his Chinese cash quickly disappeared. But his Chinese cook and assistant became very concerned. "What shall we do when the money is all gone?" he asked. "Do?" the missionary responded. "Why, we shall trust in the Lord and do good. So shall we dwell in the land, and verily we shall be fed." Days went on, and still Hudson was unable to reach Nanking by native banks. Finally, in his anxiety for Duncan, he sent a brother missionary, W.D. Rudland, up the canal by boat with money for the work in Nanking. But the water level had dropped so far by the time he sailed to a point that was still at least a week away from Nanking by canal, that Rudland abandoned the boat and headed cross-country for a shorter but more strenuous 4-day, 60-mile walk to the city. By this time, the cook's savings, willingly given to the work, had been completely used up. Duncan had not a dollar left, but he went out that morning to preach as usual, reminding his anxious companion, Let us just trust in the Lord and do good. His promise is still the same. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily shalt thou be fed. That evening, W.D. Rutland understood why the water in the Grand Canal had run so low. His overland hike brought him to Nanking several days earlier than would have been possible by boat. And when he reached his colleague's house, he found Duncan's cupboards as empty as his bank account. When Duncan returned tired and hungry from preaching all day, his Chinese helper went running to meet him. "Oh, sir," he cried breathlessly, "it's all right, it's all right. Mr. Rutland, the money, a good supper." "Did I not tell you this morning?" Duncan replied, laying a kindly hand on the man's shoulder. "It is always all right to trust in the living God." Now, Hudson wasn't content to leave the challenges of pioneer missionary work to younger men like George Duncan. He and Maria readily faced as many dangers and hardships as any one of those who worked for the China Inland Mission. After only 16 months of settled life in Hangzhou, the church there already numbered 50 baptized believers. But with Wang Li-jun as pastor and John McCarthy and Jenny Faudling assisting him there, the Taylors knew that the work was in good hands. So when spring came, Hudson and Maria packed up, loaded their household and 4 children aboard a junk, and set out by canal, intending to join Duncan in Nanking or to establish another station in any city that might open up to them en route. After the untimely death of their 8-year-old daughter, Gracie, in 1867, Hudson Taylor and his wife, Maria, dedicated themselves even more completely to the work in China. Outposts were being established. Many were hearing the message of Jesus for the first time. All were encouraged. After living so long inside the city walls, the freedom and freshness of the countryside provided a welcome and beautiful change of pace. Great mulberry plantations bordered the canal, with plum, peach, and apricot orchards blooming like some great bridal bouquet. Wheat and barley covered the lush valleys, which were interspersed with great fields of peas and beans in full flower. The canal itself, alive with boat traffic, fascinated the children, just as the scenic beauty of its shores refreshed their parents. For 3 weeks they traveled with Mr. Henry Gordon, one of their young missionaries who was just beginning his own new work in the famous city of Suzhou, before their junk reached Tianjiang, at the junction of the Grand Canal and the mighty Yangtze River. So impressed was Hudson by the city and its strategic location that he determined to establish a mission station there. He began negotiations for property, which the missions eventually acquired, but since the final details of the negotiations looked as if they would drag on for some weeks, the Taylors continued their journey up the northern segment of the canal. So after 2 months of boat life, the Taylor family reached the great city of Yangzhou, the city Marco Polo once governed. Its ancient turreted walls enclosed a population of 360,000 without even one missionary. Here again, Hudson felt so burdened by the spiritual needs he saw that he decided to try to settle his family in Yangzhou. After their arrival there, Maria wrote Mrs. Berger, "Were it not that you yourselves are old travelers, I should think it impossible for you to realize our feelings last Monday week, when we exchanged the discomfort of a boat into every room of which the heavy rain had been leaking, for a suite of apartments in a first-rate Chinese hotel. Such a place as my husband, who has seen a good deal of Chinese travelers' accommodations, never before met with. And that hotel, too, inside the city of Yangzhou." Their reception by a friendly innkeeper and crowds of interested visitors greatly raised the Taylors' hopes for the promise of an effective new mission station in that great city. And when a favorable proclamation came from the governor on their behalf, they soon acquired a house into which the family moved in the middle of July. The summer heat was already trying, and they hoped for quieter days in August. But the rush of patients and visitors continued. A foreign family seemed quite an attraction, especially as Hudson proved to be such a skillful physician. Maria also established her own reputation among the women who were charmed by her pleasing Chinese speech and manners. Before long, just as had happened in Hangzhou, hearts began opening to the gospel, and the presence of a mother and children helped diffuse most suspicion. But their successes didn't come without trials or opposition. The children all contracted measles, and the tailor's youngest son developed a life-threatening case of bronchitis as a complication. Hudson himself grew so ill that for some time he wasn't at all sure he would survive. During the summer, some of the city's literati held a meeting and decided to stir up trouble. Anonymous handbills appeared all over the city, attributing the most revolting crimes to foreigners, especially those whose business it was to propagate the religion of Jesus. Before long, the missionaries witnessed the changing attitude of the people. Friendly visitors gave way to crowds of disorderly rabble who congregated outside the tailor's home, shouting insults at the missionaries. A fresh set of posters added fuel to the flame. Time after time, rioting was prevented only by the kind, patient words of a sick and very weakened Hudson tailor, who stood in the doorway of his home, quietly answering all accusations and reassuring an angry mob that they intended no harm. Finally, the intense heat of August was broken by torrential rains, which effectively scattered the crowds, and the tailors felt doubly relieved and heartened when the Rudlands and George Duncan arrived to help them. However, the relief was short-lived. 2 foreigners from Xinjiang, Europeans in foreign clothing, came up to visit Yangzhou, causing quite a stir through the city, and those opposing the tailors saw too good a chance to pass up. No sooner had the visitors left and everything returned to normal again that the literati began circulating the rumor that children all over the area were reported missing. The story was that 44 children had been kidnapped by the inhuman foreigners. Everywhere the troublemakers were saying, "Let's avenge our wrongs! Attack! Destroy the foreigners! Much loot shall be ours!" As a mob, intent on destruction, gathered outside the mission house, Hudson and George Duncan slipped away under cover of darkness and raced toward the governor's palace for help. As Hudson described it, "But for the protection afforded us by the darkness, we should scarcely have reached the Ya men, the police, alive. Alarmed by the yells of the people, the gatekeepers were just closing the doors as we approached, but the momentary delay gave time for the crowd to close in upon us. The as yet unbarred gates gave way to the pressure, and we were precipitated into the entrance of the hall. Had the gates been barred, I'm convinced that they would not have been opened for us, and we should have been torn to pieces by the enraged mob." Inside the governor's residence, Hudson and his friend were kept anxiously awaiting. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of a riot, where they'd left the other missionaries and Maria and the children at the mercy of a mob that had already swelled to 8,000 to 10,000. Finally, the governor came out. Hudson pleaded for his help in calming the crowd and restoring order, and the official responded by calling out 3,000 troops who soon dispersed the crowds. Still, fearful for the safety of the others, Hudson and George hurried back to the mission. Hudson wrote, "We returned under escort. On the way back, we were told that all the foreigners we had left were killed. We had to cry to God to support us, though we hoped this might prove exaggerated or untrue. When we reached the house, the scene was such as baffled description. Here, a pile of half-burned reeds showed where one of the attempts to fire the premises had been made. There, debris of a broken-down wall was lying. And strewn about everywhere were the remains of boxes and furniture, scattered papers and letters, broken work boxes, writing desks, dressing cases, and surgical instrument cases, smoldering remains of valuable books, but no trace of inhabitants within. An agonizing search revealed that the missionaries and the children were hiding at a neighbor's house. After the rioters had broken in and begun burning the building, they had all escaped onto a roof and jumped to the ground in the darkness. Some had been injured. One young missionary had received a serious head wound from a rock. Maria had injured her leg leaping from the roof, and others had various cuts and bruises. But they were all alive, and they were just as grateful to be found by Hudson as he was to find them. As miraculous as their survival had been, Hudson decided not to take unnecessary chances. He loaded everyone on a junk and headed down the canal until passions cooled in Yangzhou. Only 48 hours after the riot, as their boat neared Qingyang, Maria wrote in a letter, "Our God has brought us through. May it be to live henceforth more fully to His praise and glory."